G'day everyone and welcome back. This week we're going to have a look at another tutorial for some easy to build wargaming terrain. Specifically we're going to have a look at making these little tank traps that I've made here. Now these are pretty simple to make. I did look at a couple of different designs for these throughout the week as I was building them. You'll see this one here is probably a little bit more accurate to what a tank trap should look like. These ones are a little bit trickier to build. You could probably see there's nothing too complicated about it. You could probably figure that out yourself. I just found these ones are a little bit trickier to build, and they don't exactly go with the terrain idea I have in my head. I like the idea that these are hastily constructed from perhaps the ruins of the buildings around. So that's what I'm going to tell myself, especially because these ones are slightly easier to build. So the materials for this week are pretty simple. Again, I'm using the thin paddle pop sticks I found at the craft store. You can certainly, as I mentioned before, use the short paddle pop sticks for this. It'll just change the scale a little bit. But these are the ones I bought. It was only about $1.50 I think for the packet. And there's plenty in there to do a lot of terrain building. The other thing we need is some matchsticks. Again, a couple of bucks will get you, I think, about 500 or so I got. And that's what we're going to use for this build. I've got my cutters again. I found some slightly less rusty ones in the shed, so I'll be using those. It makes it a bit easier to cut through the paddle pop sticks there. You could probably use a craft knife, but it's not ideal. I wouldn't recommend it. It's a lot of work. So if you've got something to cut those with, even a pair of scissors, if the wood's thin enough, it will be fine. A lot better than trying to cut that with a craft knife. So let's get stuck into it. Now the length of the beams I'm using for my tank traps are going to be 5 centimeters. It's more by design of the matchstick. That's the length of those matchsticks, and I didn't really want to try and make them any longer than that. If I had a longer matchstick, I would possibly use that and make a slightly different scale, but that's fine. 5 centimeters will be all right. So all I'm going to do here is just trim these rounded ends off one side of those long paddle pop sticks there. And then we're just going to mark out that 5 centimeters on each of them, just so that we can go in then and make some pretty accurate cuts. They don't have to be perfect. There's going to be variation in these, but try to be as accurate as you can with your measurements, just so we don't have to throw any of these bits away. So go through and cut those all up, and we're ready to start the build here. Now you can use hot glue for this process. I don't recommend it for this stage. You might want to use it a little bit later on, but at this stage of the project I found the hot glue was a little bit hard to use. It's a bit messy and you can't really make too many adjustments once you put your matchstick on there, and you've got to be quite quick about it. I find with the PVA glue, if you've got the patience to wait for it, it'll end up with a much better effect, and it'll be a fair bit stronger too. So with this part of the process, what I'm going to do is actually lay down a bead of glue, roughly about the size of the matchstick. And I'm actually just going to, you can use your fingers for this. I'm going to use a pair of tweezers just because it won't be in the way as much for the camera here. All you're going to do then is just lay those down roughly where they should go. You want them to be in the middle and lined up end to end as well. And once you've got it roughly in the spot you want it, just push it to the side. Make sure you give it a little press down. If you've got a bent match, you might find it doesn't want to sit down straight. Maybe just throw the match away and get another one, or flip the match around to a different side, sorry. You might find that'll do the trick. Make sure when you go from gluing each one that you haven't got glue stuck to your fingers or to the tweezers that you're using. It'll just make it a little bit trickier to make the adjustments, as everything else tend to stick to your fingers or to the tweezers obviously. Now you're going to need 3 beams for each tank trap that you want to build, so keep that in mind. Here I'm building 4 beams, doesn't make a lot of sense. I will go back after I film this clip and make some more beams. I think these will be pretty good just in my scatter terrain anyway, so I might make a few of these extra beams just to use in some other things, maybe on some bases and stuff like that. I think they look pretty good once they're painted up. Now for the next step here, I've just left those sticks to glue for a minute or two, just so that they're, at least that bottom layer has got some sort of adhesion to it, so it doesn't just pull away as I'm moving these around. So just lay a bead of glue across the top. You don't need to be too clean with this, but you know, you don't want big goops of glue everywhere. It will affect the paint in the end if you've got big blobs that have dried on there. So try to keep it, you know, that nice straight bead along the top. Now when you go to put these on, when you press down that top stick onto the beam, it will just grab on generally. So you can just push it down and then lift the beam up off the table. Remember, if this is still wet from your first stage, like mine are, just be very gentle with them. They will break apart quite easy, but because we're using PVA, it's not too hard to move these around. And even if you need to put some more glue on and have another go at getting it on there, you can certainly go ahead and do that. You'll see here that there's nothing really to this from this point. It's just pushing these on and then lining them up and then setting them off to dry. So I'll get stuck into this and get the rest of these all glued on. It doesn't matter if you have a little bit of variation. As you can see there, some of these aren't exactly lined at the end. Once we get these painted up, they'll look fine. Now you do want to leave these to dry for a good while, at least half an hour I'd say, longer if you can, just so that you can handle these and start the next step without having to worry about them breaking apart. So all we're doing here now is lining up these beams to make our shapes. Just play around with this and find what works. Generally you'll want to have a front to work with when you're lining up your shapes, just so that when you start your glue up and you get to your next steps to glue the third beam in, you know where you're supposed to be putting it. So you can go ahead and mark which is the top end of each beam. The shape might be enough for you to know. I'll go here and just mark this with a pencil, partly so that when I glue them up I know that they'll be straight. But get an idea of what shape you want to go with. Honestly, it's a bit hard for me to say exactly where to put this. You might just have to build one, roll the dice on where you put these beams and see how it looks when you stand it on your table. They're not hard to make, so honestly have a play around. Like you can see, I've got the couple of different designs up there. It's not hard to figure out something else to do with these, or some way to make them a little bit different, to maybe more fit your table or the scale you're working with. So here I've just made a quick line on there just to make sure that these are going to line up and be pretty even across the top. It doesn't matter too much at the end of the day. These are hastily constructed defences as far as we're concerned, so no one's got time to measure twice in this war, so they don't have to be perfect. Now to glue these first two bits together is really simple. You've got two flat ends just to put them on. There's a good contact point there. All you'll need to do is just line up those lines if you made them, or just eyeball it to make sure that they're pretty even. You do want roughly a right angle, or as close to a right angle that you can with these ones, just because when you go to put that next beam in underneath, it'll sit a little bit more flush and it'll have more contact for the gluing. So once we get that one in place and lined up pretty straight, we can just set it down. I just use the third beam there to prop up the gluing, the bar I've just glued on there, just so that the pressure of it leaning on its side doesn't unglue it. That works fine. We're going to leave these now for maybe 5 or 10 minutes would be enough, I think, just to let this first beam dry on there and at least get enough adhesion with that glue to let us pick it up and put the third beam on there. So I'll just go ahead here and finish the glue up on the second one. I did want to say a quick thank you to those that have subscribed so far. I really appreciate that. I am trying to get a video out regularly, so if you are interested in this type of thing, or you're looking for some different ideas for your wargaming terrain, please hit the subscribe button. I really do appreciate it. So anyway, we're going to set those down now to dry. We're going to leave them for probably maybe 10 minutes or so, should be enough. The longer the better really with that PVA glue though, so 10 minutes is probably a minimum for this stuff. Again, the longer the better. So when we come to glue these bits in here, we don't have the same amount of contact points as we did with the first two beams, because we don't have two flat sides to glue together. so we will need some extra glue in here. I would highly recommend using a hot glue gun at this point. There's no real reason to use PVA, I don't think. If you line it up before you put the glue on, you should be fine to just use your hot glue and put this in here, and it'll be in place and ready to go, within seconds. This PVA glue is fine. The PVA glue will leave less of a mess to paint over, I guess, than the hot glue does. But really, it is a bit tricky gluing this way. I found I had to hold it in place for 30 seconds to a minute before it sort of gripped in there and I could put it down. Putting it down is not easy either, being the shape that it's in, so you will need a couple of things to sort of prop this up between, to kind of hang, which I'll show you. Live and learn, I guess. Found that using the concrete barriers we made last week was perfect for this. I'll shamelessly put a link at the top of the screen here for those. Why not? So once you've got those all glued together, put them aside to dry. You really do want to leave these for as long as you can. The longer the better, especially if you're using PVA. If you were lucky enough to do that with hot glue, you could probably just start on this next step straight away. So for this, you probably don't need to, but I used the PVA and water with some black paint in it. I just figured it couldn't hurt. It's probably going to give it a little bit of extra strength, maybe fill some of those gaps in where the glue didn't before. So I'm just going to go through and coat these in that black. It'll give us a good base coat to add our colors. And here we are. So here's our finished product. I haven't gone to a lot of trouble painting these ones, I'm sorry. This is just a whole red with a dry brushing of some silver over the top. These look fine. These are small little bits on the side for me, so I'm happy with these. I might go and add some more rust effects to these, just a real basic rust effect like I did in the video number 2, which I'll put a link to, which is just done with mostly craft paints. It's not the best effect, but it does look quite good, and they fit in quite well with the pieces we've built so far. So I'm really happy with that. Remember, have a play around. You might find different designs that work for you or work with your terrain. So I really hope you found some part of this helpful. Please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you again next week.